I was still standing near the hostess station when I heard my son whisper to the manager, "If my mother asks for anything tonight, don't prioritize her. We have important guests here." A second later, 3 waiters walked past me carrying champagne for everyone else at the table. No menu, no water, no eye contact. My daughter-in-law Rebecca smiled politely at the investors sitting nearby, pretending not to notice me standing there like I didn't belong in the restaurant my husband and I built from nothing. My grandson Noah looked at me with guilt in his eyes. And my son, he wouldn't even look at me. What Michael didn't know was that Silver Fork Grill had never truly belonged to him. Before I continue, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever been hurt by someone you sacrificed everything for? Please share your story in the comments. And if this story touches your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I truly love reading every single comment. People see the polished silver signs outside Silver Fork Grill now and think it was always elegant. They see the crystal chandeliers, the valet parking the wine walls stretching 2 stories high, and they assume people like my family were born into comfort. They don't see the grease burns on my arms from 1974. They don't see the nights I cried in a diner bathroom because my feet bled through my shoes after 14-hour shifts. And they certainly don't see the young woman I used to be, the girl who once stood in the pouring Texas rain with exactly $6 in her pocket and nowhere to sleep. I was 18 years old when I became a waitress at a tiny roadside diner outside Houston. The owner hired me because another girl quit in the middle of a shift. I still remember him looking at me and saying, "Can you carry plates without dropping them?" I lied and said yes. That first night, I dropped an entire tray of coffee onto a truck driver wearing a white shirt. I thought I'd be fired immediately. Instead, the truck driver laughed so hard he nearly fell off the stool. "Kid," he said, wiping coffee from his sleeve, "you look more scared than I am." That was the first time I met Edward White. Back then, he worked in the diner kitchen, cooking eggs and burgers for barely more money than I made. He wasn't handsome in the movie star kind of way. His nose had been broken years earlier playing high school football, and he had rough hands from years of hard labor. But Edward had kind eyes, the kind that made you feel safe. Within a year, we were inseparable. We worked double shifts together. We shared cheap meals after closing time. Some nights, we sat outside behind the diner, eating cold fries under the stars, while talking about impossible dreams. Edward wanted to own a restaurant someday. Not a fancy place. Just somewhere families could walk into and feel welcomed. Somewhere nobody would feel judged for being poor. I fell in love with him the night he gave away his own dinner to a homeless man sitting outside the diner. We had almost nothing ourselves, but Edward still said, "People remember kindness longer than money, Hannah?" That sentence stayed with me my entire life. We got married when I was 22. Our wedding ring payments were late 3 times. Our first apartment had roaches. And when our son Michael was born, we were so broke, I cried, because we couldn't afford a proper crib. Edward built one himself in the garage. That crib became one of my favorite memories. Michael used to sleep peacefully while Edward and I stayed awake all night, doing restaurant bookkeeping at our kitchen table. When Michael was little, he adored us, especially Edward. He used to run around the diner wearing a tiny apron pretending he worked there. Customers loved him. One older woman used to call him Little Boss. I remember one afternoon when Michael was maybe 7 years old. The diner was packed, and I was carrying 4 plates at once while trying not to panic. Suddenly, I looked down and saw Michael wiping tables with a rag twice the size of his hand. "I'm helping Mom," he proudly told customers. Back then, he wasn't ashamed of where we came from. Back then, he was proud of us. Years later, Edward and I finally opened our own small restaurant. The first Silver Fork Grill. It wasn't glamorous. The sign outside flickered half the time. The booths were secondhand, and the kitchen air conditioner broke every summer. but people came because of the atmosphere. We remembered customers' names. We fed people who couldn't always pay. We treated our employees like family, and slowly, impossibly, the business grew. One restaurant became 3. 3 became 10. Then 20. Before I realized it, Silver Fork Grill had locations across multiple states. Newspapers called us America's most welcoming restaurant chain. But what made me proud wasn't the money. It was the people. Employees stayed with us for decades. Customers celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and marriage proposals in our restaurants. Silver Fork Grill became part of people's lives. Edward and I built that together. Not with greed, with sacrifice. Then everything changed the year Edward died. Even now, after all these years, talking about it still hurts. He had a heart attack in the middle of a supplier meeting. One moment, he was laughing on the phone with me. The next moment, he was gone. I remember standing in our bedroom afterward, staring at his empty closet for hours because I couldn't accept the silence. Michael stepped in during that time. At first, I was grateful. He seemed responsible, supportive, loving. He told me, "Mom, Dad built this company for you. I'll protect it." And for a while, I believed him. I slowly handed him more responsibility, more authority. Eventually, he became CEO. I still remember the pride in my chest the day I announced it publicly. I thought Edward would have been proud too. At first, Michael did well. He expanded the business, modernized the restaurants, increased profits. But somewhere along the way, something inside him changed. At first, it was small things. He stopped visiting older restaurant locations. He started correcting the way I dressed before company events. "Mom," he once said gently, "you don't have to tell people you used to be a waitress." I laughed back then. I thought he was just trying to help. Then came Rebecca. Beautiful, elegant, polished. The kind of woman who looked perfectly comfortable holding a champagne glass in a room full of millionaires. At first, I truly tried to love her. I bought her thoughtful birthday gifts. I invited her into family traditions. I even gave her my late mother's bracelet the day she married Michael. But Rebecca never looked at me warmly, only politely, like I was someone she tolerated. The first time she embarrassed me publicly was during a charity gala in Chicago nearly 10 years ago. Someone asked how Edward and I started the company. I smiled and began telling the story about the roadside diner. Rebecca interrupted me with a tight smile. "Oh, Hannah loves exaggerating the struggling years," she laughed. "Michael basically turned the company into what it is today." The room laughed politely, and I laughed too. But something inside me cracked that night. After that, Michael slowly stopped talking about our family history in interviews. Then one day, I visited company headquarters and noticed something strange. The founder's wall had changed. Edward's photograph remained. Mine was gone. I stood there staring at the empty space longer than I should have. When I asked Michael about it later, he barely looked up from his phone. "We're updating the company image," he said casually. The company image. As if I were some embarrassing stain he needed to remove. Still, I stayed silent. Because he was my son. Because I loved him. Because mothers spend their whole lives convincing themselves their children will eventually remember who stood beside them when nobody else did. But sitting alone in that restaurant tonight, while waiters ignored me like I was invisible, for the first time in my life, I started wondering if maybe I had already lost my son years ago. The dining room glowed with soft, golden lighting, expensive wine glasses, and the quiet sound of piano music drifting through hidden speakers. To anyone walking past our table, we probably looked like the perfect, wealthy American family celebrating a 16-year-old boy's birthday. But beneath that polished surface, something ugly was unfolding right in front of me. and everyone at the table knew it. I sat at the far end near the window, while investors and executives laughed loudly around Michael. Rebecca sat beside him, wearing a cream-colored designer dress that probably cost more than my first car. Every few minutes, she touched his arm, possessively smiling at anyone important enough to matter to her. Meanwhile, I still didn't even have water. A young waiter passed by carrying bread baskets. He stopped beside Rebecca first, then Michael, then the investors, then Noah. When he reached me, he hesitated. I watched panic flicker across his face for half a second before he skipped over me completely. Skipped over me, like I wasn't sitting there, like I didn't belong. The silence around that moment hurt more than words ever could. Noah noticed immediately. "Grandma didn't get any bread," he said quietly. The waiter froze. Before he could respond, Rebecca gave Noah a warning smile. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "don't interrupt the staff. They're very busy tonight." The boy lowered his eyes instantly. I felt my chest tighten. Noah had Edward's eyes. Kind eyes, the same eyes that used to look at me with warmth before this family learned how to worship status instead of people. I forced myself to smile at him. "It's okay, honey," I whispered. But it wasn't okay. Not even close. A few minutes later, one of Michael's investors, a silver-haired man named Leonard, raised his wine glass. "To Silver Fork Grill," he announced proudly. "One of the finest luxury dining brands in America." Everyone clinked glasses. Everyone except me, because nobody had brought me a drink. I noticed Leonard glance toward my empty place, sitting awkwardly before quickly looking away. People always look away when cruelty becomes too uncomfortable. Rebecca leaned toward one of the women sitting nearby. "You know," she said with a polished laugh, "Michael has completely transformed this company over the last decade. The brand is finally sophisticated." Sophisticated. That word again. I knew exactly what she meant. Not family-friendly, not warm, not welcoming. Sophisticated, meaning expensive enough to keep ordinary people out. The same ordinary people Edward and I had spent our lives serving. One of the investors smiled politely at me. "And how long have you been connected to the company, Mrs. White?" Before I could answer, Rebecca spoke for me. "Hannah mostly stays retired now," she said smoothly. "She prefers a quieter lifestyle." Retired. The word nearly made me laugh. I had spent 40 years building Silver Fork Grill. I had personally interviewed hundreds of employees. I had balanced payroll during bankruptcy scares. I had cleaned bathrooms when staff didn't show up. But now, I was being described like an elderly relative tucked away and forgotten. Michael never corrected her. Not once. Instead, he kept talking about expansion plans in Miami and Los Angeles while I sat there invisible. Then came the moment that finally broke something inside me. A waiter arrived carrying entrees, beautiful steaks, fresh salmon, truffle pasta. One by one plates were placed in front of everyone at the table. Everyone except me. Again. The waiter swallowed nervously when he reached my chair. "I'll be right back with yours," he stammered. But I could see the truth all over his face. There was no forgotten order. This was intentional. Michael didn't even look up from his conversation. Rebecca pretended not to notice. And suddenly I understood something horrifying. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This had been planned before I even arrived. My own son had prepared for my humiliation. Noah looked horrified. "Dad," he said quietly, "Grandma doesn't have food." Michael finally looked at me for the first time that evening. Not with love, not with guilt, with irritation. "Hannah," he said casually. "Did you actually order Hannah? Not Mom, not Mother, just Hannah," as if I were some distant acquaintance. For a moment I couldn't speak. I looked at my son sitting there in his tailored navy suit surrounded by wealthy people who admired him, and I struggled to recognize the little boy who once wiped diner tables beside me. Rebecca gave a soft fake laugh. "Oh goodness," she said, "these restaurants get so hectic during events." These restaurants. I nearly flinched hearing her say it. Not our restaurants. Not the company Hannah and Edward built. Just these restaurants. I slowly reached for my purse. "You know what I said quietly? I think I lost my appetite anyway." Noah's face fell immediately. "Grandma, I'm all right, sweetheart." But my voice sounded weaker than I intended. I stood carefully from the table, trying to preserve what little dignity I had left. And that's when I noticed him. Arthur Bennett, standing near the kitchen entrance. Frozen. Arthur had worked for Silver Fork Grill for over 20 years. He started as an assistant manager at one of our Dallas locations, before eventually overseeing several Chicago restaurants. Edward used to call him the most loyal man in the company. Now, Arthur stared at me like he'd just witnessed a crime. The second our eyes met, the color drained from his face. He knew. He knew exactly what was happening. And unlike everyone else in the room, Arthur looked ashamed. Michael followed my gaze and stiffened slightly. "Arthur," he called sharply, "Table 12 still needs attention." The manager blinked quickly. "Yes, sir?" "Sir." I remembered when Arthur used to call Michael Kiddo while teaching him how to refill ketchup bottles during summer shifts. Now fear had replaced familiarity. I turned toward the exit before anyone could see the tears gathering in my eyes. But before I could take more than 2 steps, Noah suddenly pushed his chair back loudly. "I want to go with Grandma," he blurted out. Rebecca's expression hardened instantly. "Noah," she said in a low warning tone, "sit down." The boy hesitated. I saw the conflict all over his face. Love battling fear. God, he was only 16. He shouldn't have been trapped between loyalty and obedience like this. "It's okay," I told him gently. "Stay and enjoy your birthday." His eyes filled with guilt, and for one terrible moment, I saw Michael in him again. Not the cruel version sitting at the table now. The little boy he used to be. The boy who loved me. I gave Noah one last smile before turning away. As I walked past the dining room, I noticed several employees staring at me uneasily. Some looked confused. Others looked angry. One older waitress near the bar actually looked heartbroken. That's when the truth finally hit me. The staff knew who I was. Maybe not all of them, but enough. Enough to understand that the founder of Silver Fork Grill was being publicly humiliated inside her own restaurant. My heels clicked softly against the marble floor as I headed toward the lobby. And behind me, hidden beneath the elegant music and expensive laughter, I heard Arthur Bennett say something in a trembling voice that made me stop cold. "Oh my God," he whispered to another employee. "Michael has no idea what he's done." I had just reached the lobby doors when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. "Mrs. White, please wait." Arthur Bennett sounded breathless. I stopped slowly, but didn't turn around immediately. For a moment, I simply stared through the restaurant's glass entrance at the cold Chicago streets outside. Snow drifted softly beneath the city lights, and somewhere across the avenue, a taxi honked impatiently. Behind me, Silver Fork Grill glowed like a palace I had helped build with my own 2 hands. And somehow tonight, I had never felt more unwelcome inside it. Mrs. White, Arthur repeated softly, "I'm so sorry." I finally turned toward him. Arthur looked genuinely shaken. His tie hung crooked now, and tiny beads of sweat glistened along his forehead, despite the winter cold outside. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Arthur glanced nervously over his shoulder toward the dining room. "They shouldn't have treated you that way," he whispered. I gave him a tired smile. You don't need to apologize for other people's choices. Yes, he said, quickly, voice trembling. I do. The emotion in his face caught me off guard. Arthur Bennett was not an emotional man. In 20 years, I had probably only seen him cry once at Edward's funeral. But tonight, he looked devastated. I tried to stop it, he admitted quietly. When Michael gave those instructions before dinner started, I told him it wasn't right. I felt my stomach tighten. So it was true, not accidental, not misunderstanding. Instructions. My own son had deliberately arranged my humiliation. Arthur lowered his eyes. He told the staff not to make a scene. Said investors were coming tonight and he didn't want... He stopped himself. Didn't want what I asked softly. Arthur swallowed hard. He said he didn't want you reminding people where the company came from. For a moment, the world around me felt strangely silent. No music, no voices, no clinking glasses. Just those words echoing painfully inside my chest. Where the company came from. As if poverty were something shameful. As if hard work were embarrassing. Edward used to say the exact opposite. He believed people should never forget where they started, because humility kept your soul intact. But somewhere along the way, Michael stopped seeing our beginnings as honorable. Now he saw them as stains to erase. Arthur looked miserable standing there. I should have called you before tonight, he admitted. I knew this dinner was going to be bad. I frowned slightly. What do you mean? Arthur hesitated. Then he motioned toward a quieter hallway near the private event offices. Please, he said carefully. There are things you need to know. Something in his tone made my heart beat slow. Dangerously slow. I followed him down the hallway, away from the dining room noise. The farther we walked, the quieter everything became, until all I could hear was the soft hum of kitchen refrigerators through the walls. Arthur stopped near a storage office and lowered his voice even further. Michael's been meeting with executives from Crown Hospitality Group for months. The name hit me instantly. Crown Hospitality, one of the coldest corporate restaurant conglomerates in America. They bought family-owned chains, cut costs aggressively, fired long-term employees, and turned warm restaurants into sterile luxury brands designed for wealthy tourists. Edward would have hated everything they stood for. What kind of meetings? I asked carefully. Arthur looked sick saying the words. He's selling Silver Fork Grill. I stared at him. No, I said automatically. Arthur nodded grimly. The deal's almost finalized. My chest tightened so sharply it actually hurt to breathe. No, I repeated more quietly this time. Not because I doubted Arthur, because I couldn't emotionally process it. Silver Fork Grill wasn't just a company. It was my life, Edward's life, our memories, our sacrifices. The idea of Michael handing it over to strangers for profit felt like hearing someone plan to bulldoze our family home. Arthur continued carefully. Crown Hospitality wants to completely rebrand the company. I crossed my arms tightly against the cold rising inside me. How Arthur let out a bitter laugh. They want younger clientele, high-end exclusivity, fewer family discounts, fewer community programs. He paused. And they plan to close almost all older locations. My heart dropped. Older locations, the original restaurants, the places where employees had worked for decades, the places where customers still brought their grandchildren every Sunday after church. Michael agreed to this, I whispered. Arthur nodded slowly. He said emotional attachment is bad for business. I closed my eyes briefly. That sounded exactly like Rebecca. Cold, calculated, image obsessed. For years, I had blamed Rebecca entirely for Michael's transformation. But standing there tonight, I realized something painful. At some point, my son stopped being manipulated and started choosing this life willingly. Arthur shifted nervously. There's more. I opened my eyes again. Tell me. He looked toward the floor before speaking. They're planning major layoffs after the sale. My stomach twisted. How many? At least 40% of current staff. 40%. I immediately pictured faces. Maria in Dallas, whose husband was recovering from cancer. Dwayne in St. Louis, who'd worked for us 27 years. Old Mrs. Patterson in Nashville, who still baked cornbread every morning at age 72 because she refused retirement. These weren't employees to me. They were family, and Michael was about to destroy their lives. Arthur's voice grew quieter. Some managers already know. Everyone's terrified. I leaned back against the wall, suddenly exhausted. How had things gotten this far without me seeing it clearly? No, that wasn't true. I had seen pieces of it for years. I just kept making excuses because mothers are experts at protecting their children from consequences, even when those children become cruel adults. Arthur watched me carefully. There's something else Michael doesn't know, he said. That made me look up immediately. Arthur lowered his voice almost to a whisper. I know the trust still belongs to you. The hallway suddenly felt very still. Most people assumed Michael owned Silver Fork Grill completely after Edward died. That was the public story. The legal reality was much more complicated. Arthur continued quickly. Edward told me years ago. He said if anything ever happened, the final authority stayed with you. I studied Arthur carefully. You never told Michael. Arthur looked horrified. Never. For the first time that evening, I saw something other than shame in his eyes. Fear. Real fear. Mrs. White, he said carefully, if Michael signs that deal without your approval, he can't finalize the sale. I finished quietly. Arthur nodded once. He doesn't know that, does he? No, I admitted softly. Michael believed he had complete control. He always had, because I allowed him to believe it, not out of manipulation, out of trust. Edward and I created the trust structure years earlier to protect the company from exactly this kind of corporate destruction. At the time, we thought we were protecting Silver Fork Grill from outside greed. We never imagined we'd need protection from our own son. Arthur exhaled shakily. I didn't know if I should tell you everything, he admitted. But after what happened tonight, his jaw tightened. He crossed a line. I looked back toward the distant dining room where faint laughter still echoed. Michael was probably entertaining investors right now. Smiling, drinking expensive wine, completely unaware that the foundation beneath his entire world was beginning to crack. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not revenge. Something colder. Clarity. I straightened slowly and picked up my purse. Arthur, I said quietly, when is the board meeting? His eyes widened slightly. Tomorrow morning. I nodded once. Then I looked him directly in the eye. Don't say a word to anyone. Arthur stared at me for a long second before understanding dawned across his face. And for the first time that night, he smiled. I barely slept that night. Chicago's winter wind rattled the windows of my penthouse while I sat alone in the dark, staring at old photographs spread across my dining table. Photographs Michael had probably forgotten existed. There was one of him, at 8 years old, wearing an oversized apron in our first restaurant kitchen. Flour covered his cheeks, and Edward stood behind him laughing while teaching him how to knead biscuit dough. Another photo showed Michael asleep in a booth after closing time while I counted receipts beside him at 2 a.m. Back then, we were exhausted, but we were happy. I picked up the oldest photograph carefully. Michael couldn't have been older than 5. He sat on Edward's shoulders outside the original Silver Fork Grill location in Houston while holding a paper sign that read, "Grand opening today." I remember that day so vividly. The sign outside the restaurant had stopped working an hour before opening, and Edward nearly had a breakdown trying to fix it. We didn't have money for repairs, so little Michael proudly volunteered to stand outside and wave customers in himself. For 6 straight hours, he smiled at strangers and shouted, "Best burgers in Texas." Every customer adored him. That little boy loved our restaurant more than anyone. So when exactly had I lost him? I leaned back in my chair, slowly exhausted by the question that had haunted me for years. The truth was, Michael's transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had happened piece by piece, quietly, like rust spreading beneath paint. The first signs appeared after business school. Michael returned home from New York different somehow. More polished, more ambitious, more impatient. At first, Edward admired it. "He's hungry," my husband said proudly once. "That's good, but hunger changes people when it's fed the wrong things." Michael became obsessed with perception, image, status, the kind of neighborhoods successful people lived in, the kind of watches successful people wore, the kind of wives successful men married. And then came Rebecca. I still remember the first time I met her. She arrived at our house wearing pearl earrings and carrying a bottle of wine that cost more than my monthly grocery budget growing up. She was beautiful in a sharp, intimidating way, perfect blonde hair, flawless makeup, elegant posture. She hugged Edward warmly. Then she shook my hand. Shook my hand. Not hugged. Not embraced. Even then, something inside me noticed the distance immediately. But Michael looked so happy that I ignored the feeling. During dinner that night, Rebecca spent most of the evening asking questions about company revenue and investor relationships instead of learning anything personal about our family. Edward noticed too. Later that night, after they left, he stood quietly at the sink, washing dishes before finally saying, "She doesn't love Michael the way we hoped someone would." I remember defending her instantly. "She's just nervous." But Edward gave me a sad look I never forgot. "No," he said quietly. "She's strategic." At the time, I thought he was being unfair. Now I realize he saw the truth years before I did. After Michael married Rebecca, subtle changes started happening almost immediately. At first, it seemed harmless. Rebecca encouraged Michael to upgrade the company image. Modern branding, luxury remodeling, exclusive menu pricing. Michael insisted those changes were necessary to compete nationally. Maybe some of them were. But then the warmth began disappearing too. Employee holiday bonuses became financial inefficiencies. Community fundraiser nights were reduced. Free meals for struggling families quietly ended. Michael called those programs emotionally driven spending. I remember arguing with him one afternoon in his office. "You can't build a restaurant business without heart," I told him. Michael sighed impatiently like I was old-fashioned. "Mom, emotions don't scale. Profit does." That sentence frightened me more than he realized, because it sounded nothing like Edward, and nothing like the little boy who once cried after seeing a homeless veteran eat alone outside our diner. Rebecca's influence became stronger over time. She hated the old restaurant stories, hated hearing about grease traps and late-night kitchen disasters, especially around wealthy people. One evening during a charity event, a reporter asked how Silver Fork Grill became successful. I started telling the story about Edward and me working double shifts while raising Michael. Rebecca interrupted with a laugh. "Oh, Hannah romanticizes the struggle years," she said. "The company really became elite after Michael took over." Elite. That word again. I remember glancing toward Michael, waiting for him to correct her. He didn't. Instead, he smiled. Not proudly, uncomfortably, like he agreed with her, but didn't want to say it himself. That moment stayed with me for weeks. Then came the Founders Wall incident. Even now, remembering it hurts. I had gone to headquarters unexpectedly one afternoon carrying homemade peach cobbler for Michael. Baking was still my way of showing love, even when relationships grew complicated. I walked through the lobby smiling at employees before suddenly stopping cold. The Founders Wall had changed. Originally, it displayed 3 large portraits: Edward, me, and our first restaurant together. Now, only Edward's photograph remained prominently centered. Mine was gone completely, replaced by a sleek corporate timeline highlighting Michael's leadership years. I stood there staring at the wall so long that a receptionist finally approached nervously. "Mrs. White." "Are you all right?" I could barely answer. When I confronted Michael later, he looked irritated instead of guilty. "Mom?" he said tiredly. The branding consultants recommended simplifying the company narrative. Simplifying the company narrative. That was the moment I realized something devastating. Michael wasn't accidentally erasing me. He was intentionally rewriting history, and Rebecca encouraged every bit of it. Still, I said nothing publicly, because despite everything, he was still my son. Mothers forgive things other people never would. We excuse cruelty because we remember scraped knees and bedtime stories. We remember tiny hands reaching for ours. We remember who our children used to be, even when they become people we barely recognize. Around 3 a.m, I finally stood and walked toward the massive windows overlooking Chicago. Snow continued falling softly over the city. Beautiful, cold, lonely. My phone buzzed suddenly behind me. I turned, quickly surprised. Michael. For one foolish second, hope rushed through me. Maybe he felt guilty. Maybe he wanted to apologize for dinner. Maybe somewhere beneath all the pride and ego, my son still existed. I answered immediately. "Hannah," he said without greeting, "you left pretty abruptly tonight." "Not Mom. Never Mom anymore." "I wasn't feeling well," I replied quietly. A pause. Then he sighed. "You embarrassed Rebecca in front of investors." I closed my eyes slowly. Embarrassed Rebecca? I hadn't even defended myself. "You're upset because I sat quietly while your staff ignored me. You know how important appearances are during negotiations," Michael snapped. "You could have at least tried to dress appropriately." There it was. The truth. Not concern, not guilt. Shame. He was ashamed of me. Ashamed of the woman who built his entire world. Something inside my chest hardened slightly then. Not hatred, just exhaustion. Deep exhaustion. Michael continued talking, unaware of the damage he was causing. "You and I need to discuss boundaries moving forward," he said. "Rebecca thinks it's best if you stop attending high-profile company events." I almost laughed at the irony. My company, my restaurants, my life's work. And my own son was trying to slowly remove me from it piece by piece. I stared out at the snowy city lights while silence stretched between us. Finally, Michael sighed again. "Hannah." For the first time in years, I didn't rush to comfort him, didn't apologize, didn't make excuses. Instead, I asked one simple question. "Michael, when did you become so ashamed of where you came from?" The silence on the other end lasted several long seconds, but when he finally answered, his voice was cold. "Successful people evolve, Mom." Then he hung up, and standing there alone in the dark, I realized my son had stopped evolving a long time ago. He had simply forgotten how to love. The next evening, I told myself I wouldn't go back to the restaurant. I truly meant it. After everything that had happened, The humiliation still sat heavy in my chest, like a stone I couldn't swallow. I spent most of the day walking aimlessly through my apartment, trying to convince myself that Michael's behavior no longer had the power to hurt me. But pain caused by strangers fades quickly. Pain caused by your child settles into your bones. Around 7 o'clock that night, I realized I'd left my cashmere shawl behind at the restaurant. Edward had given it to me years earlier during our 20th anniversary trip to Vermont. It wasn't expensive, but it carried memories. And memories are harder to replace than objects. I almost called the restaurant to ask someone to bring it to me, but something stopped me. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, or maybe a small, foolish part of me still hoped Michael would feel ashamed after last night. The city streets were crowded when I arrived at Silver Fork Grill again. Friday night, customers filled the valet entrance, laughing beneath the glow of expensive lights while snow drifted through the air. For a moment, I just sat in the car, watching people walk into the restaurant. Most of them had no idea who built it, and maybe that was exactly what Michael wanted. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with polished energy. Crystal glasses clinked softly. Servers moved gracefully between tables. Somewhere near the piano bar, people laughed loudly over cocktails. The hostess recognized me instantly. Unlike the night before, fear flashed across her face. "Mrs. White," she whispered nervously. "Welcome back." I almost smiled at the contrast. 24 hours earlier, I had been invisible. Now, everyone suddenly seemed aware of who I was. "I left a shawl here last night," I said quietly. "Yes, ma'am. I believe it's in the private lounge." "That's all right," I interrupted gently. "I know where it is." She nodded quickly. As I walked down the hallway toward the private dining rooms, I noticed employees watching me carefully from a distance. Word had obviously spread after Arthur spoke with me. Fear travels fast in companies built on secrets. I reached the hallway near the executive lounge when I heard voices ahead, Michael's voice and Rebecca's. Instinctively, I stopped before turning the corner. "I'm telling you, she's becoming a problem," Rebecca snapped quietly. Michael sighed heavily. "Lower your voice." "I'm serious, Michael. Last night was embarrassing. Embarrassing." There was that word again. I stood perfectly still in the hallway shadows. She looked completely out of place, Rebecca continued. "The investors noticed." "She's still my mother," Michael muttered. "Yes," Rebecca replied sharply, "and your mother still behaves like a waitress from 1978. The cruelty in her voice made my stomach twist. I waited for Michael to defend me. He didn't. Instead, I heard ice clink softly in a glass before he spoke again. "She won't be involved much longer anyway." Something cold moved through me. Rebecca lowered her voice. "Have you decided what to do about the trust accounts?" My heartbeat slowed instantly. "Trust accounts?" Michael answered carefully. "Thomas Reed still has too much influence over her finances. You need control before the acquisition goes public," Rebecca insisted. "If Hannah becomes emotional, she could complicate things." Complicate things? As if I were some unstable old woman instead of the person who built the company they were trying to sell. Michael sounded tired now. "I already told you once the Crown deal closes, it won't matter." Rebecca let out a sharp breath. "You're being naive." Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Michael," she said coldly, "your mother needs to be moved somewhere she can be managed." I felt my entire body go still. Managed. Not cared for. Managed. Michael didn't answer immediately, and in that silence, I realized something terrifying. He was considering it. Rebecca continued speaking calmly, almost clinically. "There are luxury assisted living communities with private medical staff. Beautiful places. Discreet places. I pressed my hand against the wall beside me to steady myself. This couldn't be happening. Not my son. Not the little boy who used to crawl into bed beside me after nightmares. She's lonely anyway, Rebecca added. And honestly, Michael, investors notice when she's around. There it was again. Investors. Image. Appearances. Somewhere along the way, my son had started valuing strangers' opinions more than his own mother's dignity. Michael finally spoke. She's getting older. My throat tightened instantly. Older. Not stronger. Not wiser. Just older. Rebecca softened her tone slightly, manipulating him the way she always did when she wanted something. I'm trying to help you, she said gently. You've worked too hard building this company to let emotional baggage damage your future. Emotional baggage. I closed my eyes. That's what I had become to them. Not family. Not the woman who sacrificed everything for Michael. Just baggage. Then Rebecca said something even worse. What happens if she changes the will? Michael laughed softly. She won't. How can you be sure? Because guilt controls her, he answered casually. Mom always forgives me. The words hit harder than anything else that night, because they were true. For years, guilt had controlled me. Guilt whenever I disappointed him. Guilt whenever we argued. Guilt whenever I tried standing up for myself. Michael knew exactly how much I loved him. And somewhere along the way, he learned to use that love as a weapon. Rebecca lowered her voice further. Once the acquisition money comes through, we'll have complete financial security. Then we can finally move past all this. All this. Meaning me. Michael sighed heavily again. She'll resist at first. Then let the attorneys handle it. Rebecca replied coldly. You're her son. Eventually she'll give in. That was the moment something inside me finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, like ice cracking beneath too much weight. For years, I had tolerated disrespect because I believed love required endurance. I excused cruelty because I remembered who Michael used to be. I stayed silent because I thought protecting my son mattered more than protecting myself. But standing there in that hallway listening to my child discuss controlling my life, my money, my freedom, I finally understood something painful. Love without respect becomes permission for abuse. And I had been giving Michael permission for years. My eyes burned with tears, but strangely, I no longer felt weak. I felt awake. I stepped backward carefully before they could hear me and walked silently down the hallway toward the lobby. Each step felt heavier than the last. Not because I was uncertain, because I was grieving. Grieving the son I thought I had. Outside, cold winter air hit my face immediately. For several seconds, I just stood there beneath the falling snow, trying to breathe. Cars moved through downtown Chicago. People laughed nearby. Life continued normally around me while my entire world quietly changed. Then I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. There was only one person I trusted completely now. Thomas Reed, Edward's closest friend. The man who helped us structure every protection around Silver Fork Grill decades earlier. My fingers trembled slightly as I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. Hannah. I swallowed hard. Thomas, I whispered. I need to see you tonight. A pause, then his voice sharpened instantly. What happened? I looked back at the glowing restaurant behind me. At the empire Edward and I built. At the place my own son now wanted to steal from me piece by piece. And for the first time in years, I stopped trying to protect Michael White from the consequences of his own choices. Thomas Reed lived in a quiet brownstone overlooking Lake Michigan, far from the glittering corporate world Michael had become obsessed with. By the time I arrived, it was nearly 10:30 at night. Snow covered the sidewalks in soft white layers, and the freezing wind cut through my coat as I climbed the front steps. For a moment, I almost turned around. Not because I doubted what I heard, because I knew that once this conversation began, there would be no going back. Thomas opened the door before I even knocked. "Hannah." One look at my face, and his expression darkened immediately. What did he do? That was the thing about Thomas Reed. He had known me almost 40 years, long enough to recognize heartbreak before I even spoke. I stepped inside silently while he closed the door behind me. His home smelled faintly of coffee, old books, and cedarwood. Warm, familiar, safe. Edward used to joke that Thomas's house felt more like a library than a home. Tonight, I was grateful for that quietness. Thomas guided me toward his study without another word. A fire crackled softly in the corner while shelves packed with legal books towered around us. I sat slowly in the leather chair across from his desk. And then, for the first time in years, I cried. Not politely, not quietly. I cried like a woman grieving someone still alive. Thomas didn't interrupt me. He simply handed me a handkerchief and waited. When I finally managed to speak, my voice sounded exhausted. "He wants to put me away." Thomas's jaw tightened instantly. What I told him, everything. The restaurant, the humiliation, the ignored meals, the conversation in the hallway, Rebecca, the assisted living plans, the trust accounts, every painful word. Thomas listened in complete silence, but the longer I spoke, the colder his expression became. By the end, he looked furious. "That boy has lost his damn mind," he muttered. I lowered my eyes. "He's not a boy anymore." "No," Thomas replied sharply. "He's a man abusing the love his mother has given him." The bluntness hurt because it was true. For several moments, the room fell quiet, except for the crackling fire. Then Thomas stood slowly and walked toward an old mahogany cabinet against the wall. He unlocked the bottom drawer with a small brass key. My stomach tightened immediately. I knew what was inside. The documents Edward and I created decades ago. The protections, the safeguards, the things we never imagined we'd actually need. Thomas carried a thick black folder back to the desk and placed it carefully in front of me. Even after all these years, seeing it still made my pulse quicken. "Edward insisted we structure the company this way for a reason," Thomas said quietly. I touched the edge of the folder gently. Back then, Silver Fork Grill was growing rapidly, and larger corporations had already begun trying to buy us out. Edward feared that one day greed would destroy the company culture we fought so hard to build. So Thomas helped us create something complicated, a trust structure designed to protect the company from hostile takeovers and from reckless leadership. At the time, it felt overly cautious. Now it felt prophetic. Thomas opened the folder slowly. Stacks of legal documents filled the pages. Ownership agreements, voting controls, trust provisions, signatures from decades earlier. Mine, Edward's. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "Michael owns executive authority," he explained carefully, "but not final controlling interest." I nodded silently. I already knew this, but hearing it out loud now felt different. Real. Powerful. Thomas continued. "The White Family Trust still controls 51% of Silver Fork Grill's voting power. And I control the trust," I finished quietly. Thomas nodded once. "Completely." I leaned back slowly in my chair. For years, I had allowed Michael to operate as if the company belonged entirely to him. I wanted him confident, respected, successful. I never imagined that confidence would become entitlement. Thomas flipped to another section of documents. More importantly, he added, the trust agreement requires your written authorization for any acquisition or sale exceeding 20% of corporate assets. I stared at the paperwork. Meaning Michael's deal with Crown Hospitality was impossible without me. And he didn't even know it. A strange mixture of sadness and disbelief moved through me. Michael had spent years acting like he controlled everything while never bothering to fully understand the company structure his father built. Arrogance makes people careless. Thomas studied my face carefully. Hannah, he said gently, you need to understand how serious this situation is. I know. No, he replied firmly. I don't think you do. He slid another file toward me. These are internal financial projections from Crown Hospitality. I opened the folder slowly. The numbers made my stomach drop. Mass layoffs, location closures, healthcare cuts, community program eliminations. They planned to strip Silver Fork Grill down to its most profitable parts and discard everything human about it. Edward would have been devastated. Thomas pointed toward a highlighted section. They specifically identified older employees as financial liabilities. I immediately thought of Maria, Dwayne, Mrs. Patterson, people who dedicated decades of their lives to our company. People Michael once knew by name? How could he agree to this? I whispered. Thomas gave me a sad look, because Michael stopped viewing employees as people a long time ago. The room felt unbearably heavy. I stared into the fire while memories flooded back. Michael as a child handing free pie slices to exhausted truck drivers. Michael hugging dishwashers goodbye after shifts. Michael once crying because a waitress at our Houston location couldn't afford Christmas gifts for her children. That boy had existed once. I know he had. So, where had he gone? Thomas interrupted my thoughts carefully. The board meeting is tomorrow morning. I know. Michael intends to finalize preliminary acquisition approval. I looked at him slowly. And if I stop it, Thomas didn't hesitate. Legally, you can remove him as CEO immediately. The words hung heavily between us. Remove him. My own son. I suddenly felt sick. Because despite everything, I still loved him. That was the cruelest part of motherhood. Love survives even when trust dies. Thomas seemed to understand exactly what I was feeling. Hannah, he said quietly, this isn't punishment. I looked up at him. This is protection. Protection. Not revenge, not humiliation. Protection. For the employees, for Edward's legacy, for the company we built, for myself. Thomas leaned forward slightly. There's something else you should know. What his expression hardened. Michael has already begun privately purchasing luxury property in Manhattan. I frowned slightly. What kind of property? A penthouse worth nearly $11 million. My chest tightened. With what money? Thomas's silence answered the question before he spoke. Projected acquisition bonuses. I stared at him. Michael had already started spending money from a deal he legally couldn't even complete. That wasn't ambition anymore. That was greed. Pure greed. Thomas closed the folders carefully. Hannah, he said softly, Edward trusted you to protect this company if Michael ever lost his way. Tears burned behind my eyes again, because suddenly I could hear Edward's voice so clearly. People remember kindness longer than money. Somewhere along the way, Michael forgot that lesson. But I hadn't. Thomas pushed a final document toward me, a temporary voting authorization. One signature from me would immediately freeze all acquisition activity pending trust review. My hand trembled slightly as I picked up the pen. This was the moment everything changed. Not because I wanted power, because my son had forced me to finally use it. I stared at the signature line for several long seconds. Then slowly, I signed my name, Hannah White. The moment the pen left the paper, Thomas exhaled quietly. "It's done," he said. Outside the study windows, snow continued falling over Chicago. Soft, silent, cold. And somewhere across the city, Michael White was probably sleeping peacefully tonight, completely unaware that by tomorrow morning the world he believed belonged to him would begin slipping through his fingers. The Silver Fork Grill corporate headquarters sat in the center of downtown Chicago, like a monument to success. Glass walls, marble floors, polished steel elevators. Everything Michael loved. Everything Edward once warned me not to become obsessed with. I arrived 15 minutes before the board meeting began. Thomas Reed walked beside me, carrying a leather briefcase filled with documents that could destroy my son's entire future. Neither of us spoke much in the elevator. What was there left to say? My heart already felt heavy enough. When the elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Employees froze when they saw me. Some looked shocked. Others looked nervous. One young assistant nearly dropped her tablet. "Mrs. White," she stammered quickly. "Good morning." I smiled politely. It struck me how strange this building had become over the years. When Edward and I first started expanding the company, our offices felt warm and alive. Managers laughed openly. Employees decorated doors during holidays. People brought homemade food to meetings. Now, everything looked sleek, cold, expensive, like a luxury hotel where nobody truly relaxed. Thomas leaned toward me quietly. "Word spread last night," he murmured. "I can tell." People watched us carefully as we walked toward the boardroom. Fear travels faster than respect in corporations. At the far end of the hallway, I noticed Arthur Bennett standing near the conference doors. The moment he saw me, relief flashed across his face. He approached immediately. "Mrs. White." "Arthur." He lowered his voice. "Michael's inside already." The Crown executives arrived early. Of course they did. Predators always arrive early when they smell profit. Arthur hesitated before adding softly, "He has no idea you're coming." I nodded once. Good. Through the boardroom glass walls, I could already see Michael standing confidently near a massive presentation screen. Rebecca sat beside several executives from Crown Hospitality, wearing a pristine white suit that probably cost more than some employees made in months. Michael looked relaxed, victorious, like a man already celebrating his future. The sight of him hurt more than I expected, because even now, beneath all the anger and betrayal, part of me still saw my little boy. Thomas touched my arm gently. "You ready?" "No," but I nodded anyway. Arthur opened the boardroom doors. Conversation stopped instantly. The silence hit so hard, it almost felt physical. Every head turned toward me. Michael's expression changed immediately. First confusion, then disbelief, then irritation. "Hannah," he said slowly. "Not Mom. Still Hannah." Rebecca looked even more unsettled. "What are you doing here?" she asked before Michael could speak. Thomas stepped forward calmly. "Mrs. White is attending today's meeting as controlling trustee of the White Family Trust." The room went completely still. Several Crown Hospitality executives exchanged confused looks immediately. Michael laughed awkwardly. What nobody answered him right away. I walked calmly into the boardroom while the sound of my heels echoed against the marble floor. The long conference table stretched beneath modern chandeliers, surrounded by investors' attorneys, executives, and board members. People Michael spent years trying to impress. People who suddenly looked very interested in me. Michael recovered quickly enough to force a smile. "Mom, this is a private acquisition meeting." "I'm aware," I said quietly. Rebecca crossed her arms immediately. "Then maybe this isn't the best place for family discussions?" The arrogance in her voice almost would have amused me under different circumstances. Thomas placed his briefcase carefully on the table. "This isn't a family discussion," he said evenly. "This is a legal matter." Now, Michael's expression hardened. "What legal matter?" Thomas opened the briefcase slowly, and for the first time since entering the room, I saw uncertainty flicker across my son's face. One of the board members, Harold Simmons, cleared his throat nervously. "Michael," he said carefully, "perhaps we should hear Mr. Reed out." Michael frowned sharply. Hear him out about what Thomas removed several folders and distributed copies around the table. Then he spoke the sentence that changed everything. "The proposed acquisition of Silver Fork Grill by Crown Hospitality is unauthorized." Silence. Absolute silence. Michael blinked once, then laughed again. Except this time, the sound was forced. "What are you talking about?" Thomas adjusted his glasses calmly. "The White Family Trust maintains controlling ownership authority over Silver Fork Grill Holdings." Rebecca's face lost color instantly. Michael stared at him blankly. "No?" he said immediately. "That's not possible." Thomas slid legal documents toward him. "It is entirely possible." I watched Michael's hands as he grabbed the papers. At first, he looked irritated, then confused, then pale. His eyes scanned line after line, faster and faster. Trust ownership structures, voting authority, executive limitations, acquisition restrictions. Edward and I had signed those papers decades ago, and Michael had clearly never bothered reading them carefully. He looked up sharply. "This is outdated." "It's fully enforceable," Thomas replied calmly. Michael stood abruptly from his chair. "No, I'm CEO." "Yes," Thomas said evenly. "You are CEO, not majority owner." The room erupted into whispers immediately. Crown executives leaned toward one another nervously. Board members began flipping through documents with growing concern. Rebecca looked furious. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "Michael runs this company." I finally spoke. Running something and owning something are not always the same. Her eyes locked onto mine instantly. And for the first time in years, I didn't look away. Michael stared at me like he no longer recognized me. "You knew?" he asked quietly. I held his gaze. "Yes. You let me believe I trusted you." The words hit harder than yelling ever could. Michael's jaw tightened. "You blindsided me." A strange sadness moved through me then, because he still didn't understand. He thought this moment was about power, not betrayal, not greed, not the destruction of everything Edward and I built. Power. "That's interesting," I said softly. "Considering you planned to sell my company without even speaking to me." "Our company," he corrected sharply. I looked at him for a long moment, then answered quietly. "No, Michael. It stopped being ours the moment you forgot what we built it for." The room fell silent again. Rebecca stepped forward angrily. "This is emotional manipulation." "No," Thomas interrupted coldly. "This is corporate governance." One Crown Hospitality executive suddenly cleared his throat. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "we should postpone discussions until ownership matters are clarified." Michael turned toward him immediately. "There's nothing to clarify." "There absolutely is," another attorney replied. Panic was spreading now. I could see it clearly, Because billion-dollar deals collapse quickly when hidden ownership structures appear unexpectedly. Michael slammed the documents onto the table. You did this intentionally, he accused me. His voice wasn't angry anymore. It was wounded, like a child suddenly realizing the rules had changed. I swallowed hard against the pain rising in my chest. No, I said quietly. You did. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Harold Simmons slowly stood from his chair. Harold had served on our board for nearly 20 years. Edward trusted him deeply, and now he looked exhausted. Michael, he said carefully, did you know these trust restrictions existed? Michael hesitated. That hesitation told the entire room everything. Harold closed his eyes briefly. Oh my God, another board member spoke next. You negotiated a sale without confirming legal authority. Rebecca immediately jumped in. This company needed modernization. No, Harold snapped suddenly. This company needed honesty. The sharpness in his voice shocked everyone, including me. Michael looked around the room desperately, now realizing support was slipping away faster than he could control it. And suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, my son looked afraid. Real fear. Not fear of losing money, fear of losing control. Thomas calmly slid one final document across the table. The White Family Trust is officially freezing all acquisition activity effective immediately. Michael stared at the paper in disbelief, then slowly looked back at me, and in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked the question he should have asked years ago. How much of this company do you actually own? I held his gaze steadily, then answered, enough to stop you. The silence inside the boardroom felt dangerous now. Not shocked anymore. Volatile. Michael stood frozen at the head of the conference table, still gripping the legal documents so tightly the pages had begun to bend beneath his fingers. Across from him, the Crown hospitality executives whispered urgently among themselves. One attorney was already typing rapidly on his phone, while another avoided eye contact entirely. Rebecca looked furious enough to explode. And for the first time in years, Michael no longer looked powerful. He looked exposed. This is absurd, Rebecca snapped, suddenly breaking the silence. You can't freeze a corporate acquisition because of personal feelings. Thomas Reed calmly folded his hands. This has nothing to do with feelings. Of course it does, she shot back. Hannah is emotional because Michael made business decisions she didn't like. I looked at her quietly. No, I said softly. I'm emotional because my son forgot how to treat people. Rebecca laughed sharply. Oh, please. Michael finally found his voice again. Mom, he said tightly, you're making a massive mistake. The word mom sounded strange coming from him now, almost forced, like he suddenly remembered which role he needed me to play. I held his gaze steadily. No, Michael. The mistake was believing you understood what this company stood for. He slammed the documents onto the table again. You built diners, Hannah, he snapped. I built a national brand. The room went still, not because of the insult, because of the arrogance behind it. I saw Harold Simmons slowly remove his glasses and rub his forehead tiredly. Even Rebecca looked briefly uncomfortable, but Michael kept going. You and Dad started something small, he continued, voice rising. I turned it into something investors actually respect. That hurt. Not because it insulted me, because it insulted Edward, the man who worked himself into an early grave building this company with integrity. I stood slowly from my chair. You think respect comes from stock value? I asked quietly. Michael laughed bitterly. It comes from growth. No, I replied softly. It comes from how you treat the people who helped you grow. He rolled his eyes slightly. And suddenly, I saw it clearly. Not just arrogance, contempt. Michael truly believed kindness was weakness now. That realization broke something inside me all over again. Harold finally spoke. "Michael," he said carefully, "did you disclose these trust limitations to Crown Hospitality during negotiations?" Michael's silence answered before he did. One of the Crown attorneys immediately looked alarmed. "You withheld ownership complications," he demanded. Michael turned defensive instantly. "I was handling it internally." "Internally," the attorney repeated sharply. "This deal could collapse because you failed to verify authority." Rebecca stepped in immediately. "This is being exaggerated." But the panic had already started spreading around the room. Investors hate surprises, especially expensive ones. Thomas opened another folder calmly. "There are additional concerns the board should review before proceeding with any executive confidence decisions." Michael glared at him. "What now?" Thomas slid financial reports across the table. Several board members immediately began reading. The mood shifted almost instantly. Harold frowned deeply. "What is this?" Thomas answered evenly. "Employee turnover rates over the last 3 years." Another board member looked stunned. "These numbers are terrible." Michael crossed his arms defensively. "We streamlined operations." "No," Thomas corrected coldly. "You created instability." Harold flipped through more pages slowly. 47% management turnover, he asked incredulously. I closed my eyes briefly. Edward used to know every manager's spouse by name. Now employees were leaving faster than they could be replaced. Another director looked up sharply. "Customer satisfaction scores are dropping too." Michael's jaw tightened. "That's temporary restructuring." No, Arthur Bennett spoke quietly from near the back wall. "It isn't." Everyone turned toward him. Arthur looked nervous speaking in front of executives, but something stronger than fear pushed him forward. Loyalty? Real loyalty. The company culture changed, Arthur continued carefully. Employees stopped feeling valued. Michael stared at him in disbelief. "You're undermining me now, too." Arthur swallowed hard. "I'm telling the truth." Rebecca scoffed loudly. "Oh, please. This company was becoming modernized." Arthur looked directly at her. "With respect, ma'am, kindness isn't outdated." That sentence hit the room harder than shouting would have, because deep down, everyone knew he was right. Harold turned another page slowly, then suddenly looked up at Michael with genuine concern. "You planned 40% staffing reductions after acquisition?" Michael sighed impatiently. "That's standard corporate restructuring." "No," I said quietly. "That's destroying people's lives." Michael looked exhausted now. "You're making this emotional again." "Because it is emotional," I snapped suddenly. The sharpness in my own voice startled the room, including me. For years I had swallowed pain quietly, excused cruelty politely, minimized my own heartbreak to protect Michael from discomfort. But not anymore. I looked directly at my son. "You know what your father cared about most before he died?" Michael stayed silent. "Employees," I answered myself. "Families. Community." I stepped closer slowly. "He built restaurants where people felt welcome, Michael, not places where wealthy strangers could feel superior." Rebecca interrupted coldly. The company would have stagnated without Michael's leadership. I turned toward her. "And what exactly has his leadership created?" Silence. I didn't wait for an answer. "Fear," I continued. "Turnover. Greed. Employees terrified of losing healthcare while executives buy penthouses." Michael's face changed instantly. Sharp panic. Thomas had been right. Michael never expected me to discover the Manhattan property. Harold noticed immediately. Penthouses, he asked slowly. Rebecca looked toward Michael too quickly, and suddenly, the room understood. One board member muttered under his breath, "Oh my God." Michael tried recovering. "That has nothing to do with this meeting." "It has everything to do with this meeting," Harold snapped. The older man stood slowly from his chair, now visibly angry. "We trusted you." Michael looked stunned. Harold pointed toward the reports spread across the table. "You hid acquisition risks. You ignored trust restrictions. Employee retention is collapsing. Community programs are being gutted." His voice hardened further. "And now we're learning you planned executive luxury purchases before acquisition approval?" Michael's confidence was crumbling rapidly now. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," another board member said quietly. "I think we ignored warning signs too long." Rebecca stepped forward again. "This is ridiculous. Michael increased profits every quarter." I looked at her sadly and lost the soul of the company doing it. That landed hard because nobody argued, not even Michael. The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting. Then something unexpected happened. Arthur Bennett slowly stepped closer to the table. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "I started working for Silver Fork Grill 22 years ago," he said quietly. "Mrs. White paid for my daughter's surgery when my insurance failed." The room turned toward him fully now. Arthur swallowed hard. "She never told anyone. She just helped us." His eyes shifted toward Michael. "But lately, employees are scared to ask for anything." Another voice suddenly spoke up near the wall. One of the regional managers. "Mrs. White paid my son's college tuition after my wife died." Another manager nodded quietly. "She covered medical leave for my husband. She saved our Denver location during bankruptcy." One by one, stories started filling the room. Quietly, emotionally, honestly. Not polished corporate language. Human stories. Real stories. And with every sentence, Michael looked smaller somehow. Because for the first time in years, he was being forced to confront something impossible to manipulate. Legacy. Not money. Not branding. Not stock value. Legacy. And deep down, he knew his mother's legacy would outlive his. Harold slowly sat back down at the table. Then after a long silence, he looked directly at Michael and spoke the words that changed everything. "I think the board needs to discuss temporary suspension of executive authority pending full review." Michael's face went completely white. Rebecca gasped softly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, my son finally looked truly terrified. The emergency board meeting ended in chaos. Lawyers rushed through hallways making urgent phone calls. Crown Hospitality executives left the building looking furious. Rebecca stormed out nearly 30 minutes before Michael did her heels striking the marble floor like gunshots. And Michael. He stayed trapped inside the boardroom long after everyone else had gone. Alone. For years, I had imagined some dramatic moment where my son would finally understand the pain he caused me. But standing outside that glass room, watching him sit there with his head in his hands, I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Deeply tired. Thomas approached quietly beside me. "The board officially suspended acquisition negotiations," he said softly. "And Harold is pushing for temporary executive review." I nodded once. "Michael won't forgive me for this." Thomas looked at me carefully. "Hannah, your son stopped forgiving you for being human years ago." That hurt, because it was true. I glanced back through the glass. Michael looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally. Like the confident executive persona he built over the years was finally cracking beneath pressure. For a brief moment, I almost walked inside to comfort him. That instinct never really leaves mothers, even after betrayal, even after heartbreak. But before I could move, the elevator doors opened nearby. Several regional managers stepped hesitantly onto the executive floor. I recognized most of them immediately. Linda from Nashville, Marcus from Denver, Evelyn from Dallas. People who had spent years helping build Silver Fork Grill alongside me. They looked nervous approaching. Mrs. White, Linda asked carefully. I smiled softly. Hello, sweetheart. The woman's eyes instantly filled with tears, and suddenly, before I could react, she hugged me tightly. Not professionally, not formally, like family. Oh my God, she whispered shakily. Are you all right? That simple question nearly broke me, because after days of humiliation and betrayal, someone finally asked how I felt. I hugged her back slowly. I'm all right now. Marcus stepped forward, next a tall man in his 50s with tired eyes and broad shoulders. I remembered when he started working for us as a dishwasher nearly 30 years earlier. Now he managed 3 restaurants. Mrs. White, he said quietly. We heard what happened. I sighed softly. News travels fast. He looked angry, not fast enough. The others nodded, and then something happened I never expected. One by one, they started sharing stories. Not about the company, about kindness. About moments I barely even remembered. Evelyn wiped tears from her eyes before speaking. When my husband got sick, her voice cracked. You paid our insurance premiums for almost a year. I blinked in surprise. I had forgotten that entirely. Marcus shook his head slowly. You gave me my first management opportunity after I got out of rehab, he said quietly. Nobody else would hire me. Linda laughed softly through tears. You used to personally call every employee on Thanksgiving? That one made me smile faintly. Edward started that tradition years ago. We believed nobody working for us should feel forgotten during holidays. Suddenly, another voice spoke behind the group. You paid for my daughter's funeral. I turned slowly. It was Janet, one of our longest-serving kitchen supervisors from St. Louis. She looked emotional standing there. I never got the chance to thank you properly, she whispered. The hallway fell silent, because grief never truly disappears from a person's face. I walked toward her slowly and took her hands. You don't owe me thanks for loving your child, I said gently. Janet burst into tears instantly, and suddenly everyone in that hallway looked emotional, including Thomas. I realized then something Michael never understood. People don't stay loyal because of salaries. They stay loyal because they feel seen, valued, human. That was the real foundation of Silver Fork Grill. Not branding, not luxury design, not corporate image. Humanity. Marcus glanced toward the boardroom doors. Is Michael really getting suspended? The question hung awkwardly in the air, because despite everything, many employees still cared about him. They remembered the younger Michael, too. The version before ambition hardened him. I don't know yet, I admitted honestly. Evelyn sighed heavily. He used to be different. I looked down quietly. Yes, I whispered, he did. Silence settled briefly over the group. Then Linda smiled sadly. You know, she said softly, Mr. White used to say something all the time. Edward. Even hearing people say his name still hurt after all these years. What I asked, quietly. She smiled through tears. He used to tell us, a restaurant feeds more than stomachs. It feeds dignity. God, that sounded exactly like him. Suddenly, I could picture Edward standing in our first kitchen again, laughing while flipping burgers, handing free soup to exhausted truckers during winter storms. He believed food could comfort people, connect people, heal people. Michael once believed that too. So how had we gotten here? The boardroom doors finally opened behind us. Everyone turned immediately. Michael stepped out slowly. The second he saw the crowd gathered around me, his expression changed. Confusion first, then something sharper. Realization. Because for the first time in years, he was seeing something he'd forgotten existed. Loyalty that couldn't be bought. The hallway went quiet instantly. Michael looked exhausted. His tie was loosened now, and dark circles had formed beneath his eyes. Rebecca wasn't with him. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Marcus nodded politely. Michael. Michael barely acknowledged him. His eyes stayed fixed on me instead. "What is this?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Janet spoke. "People who care about Mrs. White." The tension thickened instantly. Michael's jaw tightened slightly. "I care about my mother." The words sounded hollow even to him. Linda crossed her arms. "With respect, sir, that's not what it looked like at the restaurant." Michael's face darkened immediately. "This isn't appropriate." "No," Marcus replied calmly. "What happened to her wasn't appropriate." I could actually see Michael struggling now. Not with business pressure. With shame. Real shame. And maybe for the first time in years, nobody was protecting him from it. Michael looked around the hallway slowly. At the employees. At the managers. At the people who still loved me despite everything. Then his eyes landed on Arthur Bennett near the elevators. "You too?" he asked bitterly. Arthur met his gaze steadily. "I'm loyal to the company your parents built." That sentence landed hard. Because Michael finally understood something devastating in that moment. These people weren't choosing between him and me. They were choosing between greed and humanity. And deep down, they knew which side his father would have chosen. Michael looked back at me finally. For several seconds, his expression softened into something painfully familiar. Not arrogance, not anger. Pain. And suddenly, I saw my little boy again for just a moment. The child who used to hold my hand crossing parking lots. The boy who once cried because he accidentally hurt someone's feelings. That glimpse almost shattered my resolve completely. Then Michael spoke quietly. "You turned them all against me." The sadness in his voice hurt more than yelling ever could, because he still didn't understand. I stepped toward him slowly. "No, Michael," I said softly. "Your choices did that." He stared at me silently, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, my son looked completely lost. 3 days after the board meeting, I finally returned home to Houston. Chicago had become too heavy, too cold. Every street corner seemed filled with memories of confrontation, betrayal, and painful truths I never wanted to face about my son. I needed distance. I needed silence. Most of all, I needed Edward, or at least the feeling of him. That's why I went back to the old house. Not the luxury penthouse Michael insisted I move into years ago. Our real home. The modest 2-story brick house Edward and I bought after opening our 3rd restaurant. The house where Michael grew up. The house where we built our family before money complicated everything. I spent most of the afternoon in the kitchen, baking peach cobbler from Edward's old handwritten recipe cards. Cooking had always been the only thing capable of calming my mind. Flour dusted the counters while soft jazz played quietly from the old radio near the sink. For the first time in days, I almost felt peaceful. Then the doorbell rang. At first, I assumed it was Thomas. Or maybe one of the neighbors checking on me after seeing news reports about the board meeting leaks already spreading through business circles. But when I opened the front door, my heart nearly broke. Noah stood there alone. Snow clung to his dark jacket, and his eyes looked swollen like he'd been crying. "Honey," I whispered immediately. "What happened?" The boy tried speaking, but his voice cracked. "I'm sorry, Grandma. That was all it took." I pulled him into my arms instantly. Noah hugged me so tightly I could actually feel him trembling. And suddenly, standing there in my doorway, holding my grandson while winter wind rushed around us, I realized how starved this child was for tenderness. I led him inside quickly. The warmth from the kitchen hit us immediately, along with the smell of cinnamon and baked peaches. For a brief second, Noah looked around the house quietly, like he was remembering something. "It still smells the same," he said softly. My chest tightened. "When you were little," I smiled gently, "you used to steal peach cobbler off the windowsill before dinner." For the first time since arriving, a tiny smile appeared on his face. Dad used to blame me even when he was the one stealing it. The memory hit both of us at the same time. Michael laughing in this kitchen. Edward pretending to scold him. Family dinners around the old oak table, back when love still felt simple. I sat Noah down with hot tea and warm cobbler, while snow drifted outside the windows. For several minutes, he barely touched the food. He just stared at the table, silently. Finally, I reached across and touched his hand gently. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" His eyes filled instantly. "Everything." The word came out broken. And suddenly, the strong composure he'd been holding together collapsed completely. "I hate what's happening," he whispered. I moved beside him immediately as tears rolled down his face. "Noah, Dad's angry all the time now," he choked out. "Mom keeps yelling. Nobody talks normally anymore." I rubbed his back slowly while he cried. God, he was only 16. Children should never have to carry the emotional wreckage created by adults. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted quietly. "You can always come here." The certainty in my voice made him cry harder. After a while, Noah finally calmed enough to speak again. "I should have said something at the restaurant." I frowned softly. "Honey, no," he interrupted shakily. "I should have defended you." Guilt covered his face so heavily it hurt to look at him. "I saw what they were doing," he whispered. "I knew Dad told the waiters to ignore you." That stung, even though I already knew it, because it meant my humiliation had been visible to everyone at the table, even Noah. The boy lowered his head. I was scared. I gently lifted his chin until he looked at me. "Sweetheart, being scared doesn't make you cruel." Tears gathered in his eyes again, but I stayed quiet. I understood that guilt too well. Silence can haunt kind people for years. I squeezed his hand gently. "You know what your grandfather used to say?" Noah shook his head slightly. "He said courage usually arrives 5 minutes late." I smiled softly. Good people often freeze before they act. A weak laugh escaped him. "That sounds like Grandpa." "It does, doesn't it?" Silence settled between us again, but this time it felt softer, safer. Then Noah asked the question I'd been dreading. "Are you going to destroy Dad?" The pain behind those words nearly shattered me, because despite everything Michael had done, Noah still loved his father. Children almost always do. I took a long breath before answering carefully. "I don't want to destroy your father." "Then why is this happening?" "How do you explain betrayal to a child without poisoning his heart?" How do you tell a grandson that the man he admires forgot how to be decent? I chose honesty, because sometimes people get so focused on success that they stop seeing the damage they cause. Noah looked down quietly. Mom says you're trying to take the company away because you can't handle change. I almost smiled sadly. And what do you think? He hesitated for a long moment, then whispered something that broke my heart completely. I think Dad changed into someone I don't recognize anymore. There it was. The truth nobody wanted to say aloud. Even his own son saw it now. Noah wiped his eyes roughly. You know what Dad said after the meeting? I stayed silent. He said people only respected you because you acted like some saint. The bitterness in his voice surprised me. But that's not true, Noah continued quickly. People love you because you care about them. I stared at him quietly, because in that moment, I realized something profound. Michael had spent years trying to impress powerful strangers, and somewhere along the way, he lost the respect of the one person who mattered most. His son. Noah looked around the kitchen slowly. I miss when we used to come here every Sunday. So do I. Dad used to laugh more. I swallowed hard. Yes, he used to cook with Grandpa. Another painful memory surfaced immediately. Michael at 14 standing beside Edward flipping pancakes badly while we laughed ourselves breathless. That boy had existed once. I know he had. Noah's voice became smaller. I don't want to become like him. That sentence hit me harder than anything else that evening, because beneath the sadness in Noah's eyes, I saw fear. Real fear. Fear that cruelty might somehow be inherited. I cupped his face gently, listened to me very carefully. He looked up. You are not your father's mistakes. Tears slipped down his cheeks again. You have your own heart, your own choices, and your heart is good, Noah. The boy broke down completely then. I held him tightly while he cried against my shoulder like he did when he was little. And suddenly, I understood something clearly. Maybe this wasn't only about saving Silver Fork Grill anymore. Maybe it was about saving what remained of this family before bitterness destroyed another generation too. After a long while, Noah finally pulled back slightly. Then in a quiet voice filled with uncertainty, he asked Grandma, Yes, sweetheart, would you ever teach me how to run the restaurants? My breath caught, because in that moment, for the very first time in weeks, I felt something I thought I had lost. Hope. The official board vote happened 5 days later. I barely slept the night before. Not because I doubted the outcome, because I knew what it would cost. No matter how much Michael had hurt me, he was still my son, and no mother dreams of the day she might have to take everything away from her child. The meeting took place at the Houston Regional Headquarters instead of Chicago this time. Harold insisted on neutral ground away from media attention and Crown hospitality influence. But nothing about that morning felt neutral. The air itself felt heavy, cold, final. Thomas Reed met me outside the building just after sunrise. You don't have to do this if you're unsure, he said quietly as we walked toward the entrance. I stopped briefly. Yes, I whispered. I do. Because deep down, I finally understood something painful. Allowing Michael to continue wasn't love anymore. It was enabling destruction. Not just of the company, of himself. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere felt completely different from the last meeting. Nobody smiled. Nobody made casual conversation. Stacks of financial reports and legal documents covered the table like evidence in a trial. And in many ways, that's exactly what this had become. Michael arrived 10 minutes late. Alone. That surprised me immediately. No Rebecca, no assistance, no polished confidence. He looked exhausted. His beard had grown slightly uneven, and dark shadows sat beneath his eyes like bruises. For the first time in years, my son didn't look like a powerful executive. He looked human. And somehow, that hurt even more. When his eyes met mine across the room, something flickered there briefly. Not anger, not arrogance. Fear. Real fear. Michael sat down slowly without greeting anyone. Harold cleared his throat after several tense moments. We're here to finalize executive review recommendations following the suspended acquisition proceedings. The formal language sounded sterile compared to the emotional wreckage underneath it all. Thomas began presenting updated reports immediately. Declining employee retention, community backlash, internal ethics complaints, financial irregularities connected to acquisition preparations. Michael barely reacted outwardly, but I noticed his hands trembling slightly beneath the table. Harold finally leaned forward heavily. Michael, he said quietly, before the board votes, is there anything you'd like to say? The room went silent. Michael stared down at the table for several long seconds before finally speaking. I made decisions for growth. His voice sounded tired. Not confident, just tired. I believed modernizing the company required difficult changes. No one interrupted him. Michael swallowed hard. I didn't think emotionally. I thought strategically. That sentence alone revealed everything. Because Silver Fork Grill was never built on strategy alone. It was built on people. Harold nodded slowly. And do you regret any of those decisions? Michael's eyes finally lifted. Toward me. The silence stretched painfully between us. Then he answered honestly. I regret how this became personal. Personal. Not cruel, not wrong, just personal. Something inside me sank quietly. Even now, he still didn't fully understand. Rebecca's voice suddenly broke the silence from the doorway. Because it never should have become personal. Everyone turned immediately. Rebecca walked into the room wearing another perfectly tailored designer suit, her expression cold and furious. Michael looked startled. Rebecca. No, she snapped sharply. I'm tired of everyone acting like you committed some horrible crime. Harold frowned immediately. This meeting is restricted to board personnel. I don't care, Rebecca shot back. She looked directly at me. This entire situation is ridiculous. Thomas stood slowly. Mrs. White. No. Rebecca interrupted. Hannah is destroying her own son because she can't accept that the company evolved beyond her. The room tightened instantly. Michael rubbed his forehead. Rebecca stopped, but she kept going. You built diners, she said bitterly toward me. Michael built an empire. I stood slowly from my chair. You think success excuses cruelty? Rebecca laughed sharply. I think sentimentality destroys businesses. That sentence hung heavily in the room, because everyone knew now exactly what kind of person she was. Not ambitious, empty. Michael looked deeply uncomfortable now. Rebecca, he warned quietly. But she ignored him completely. She's manipulating all of you with emotional stories and guilt. Rebecca continued. Meanwhile, Michael turned this company into a national luxury brand. Harold's voice hardened and nearly destroyed employee loyalty doing it. Rebecca scoffed. Employees are replaceable. The room went dead silent. Arthur Bennett, sitting near the end of the table, actually looked physically sick hearing those words. And suddenly, something changed in Michael's face. Not anger at me, at Rebecca. He stared at his wife quietly, like he was hearing her clearly for the first time. Rebecca noticed too late. She kept talking, Honestly, Michael spent years cleaning up the outdated image this company had before. Outdated image. That phrase landed like a slap. Because suddenly, Michael remembered something. I could see it happen in real time. Memories. The old diners. Edward. Family dinners. Me working double shifts while carrying him on my hip as a baby. For the first time since this nightmare began, my son looked ashamed. Not defensive. Ashamed. "Rebecca," he said quietly. "Now stop talking." She blinked. "What just stop?" The room remained frozen. Rebecca stared at him in disbelief. Then her expression hardened dangerously. "Oh, so now you're turning on me too." Michael closed his eyes briefly. "I'm asking you to stop." But Rebecca had already lost control. "She manipulated everyone," Rebecca shouted, pointing toward me. "Your mother has always used guilt to control you. That finally did it." Michael stood abruptly. "No!" The single word cracked through the room sharply enough to silence everyone. Rebecca stared at him. Michael's breathing looked uneven now. "You don't get to talk about her like that." The shock on Rebecca's face almost looked unreal. Because maybe Michael had defended her for so many years that she forgot he once loved his mother deeply too. Rebecca laughed bitterly. "You can't be serious." Michael looked exhausted. "No," he whispered. "I think maybe I'm finally serious for the first time in years." Silence swallowed the room. Rebecca's face twisted with disbelief. Then fury. "Fine," she snapped coldly. "Enjoy letting your mother humiliate you." And with that, she stormed out. The door slammed hard behind her. Nobody moved. Michael remained standing there, breathing heavily, while the silence stretched painfully around us. Then, slowly, he looked at me. And for the first time since Edward died, I saw my son completely stripped of ego. No corporate mask, no polished executive charm, just a broken man finally forced to confront himself. Harold cleared his throat carefully. "The board still needs to proceed with the vote." Michael nodded weakly without taking his eyes off me. "I know." The vote happened quickly after that. Too quickly. Every raised hand felt like another piece of my heart breaking. Temporary executive removal. Immediate suspension from CEO authority. Mandatory operational review. The motion passed almost unanimously. When it was over, Michael sat down slowly, like his body could barely hold itself upright anymore. Nobody celebrated. There was nothing to celebrate. A family was collapsing in front of us. Eventually, the room emptied quietly until only Michael and I remained. For several long moments, neither of us spoke. Then finally, my son whispered something so softly, I almost didn't hear it. "What happens to me now?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly destroyed me. I walked slowly around the table until I stood beside him. Then I said the words I never imagined I'd say to my own child. "You start over." Michael looked up slowly, how I held his gaze. "The same way your father and I did." Confusion flickered across his face, then realization, and suddenly real fear entered his eyes again. "You can't mean yes." I interrupted quietly. My voice trembled despite myself. "You're going to learn what it means to serve people again." The first day Michael wore an apron again, it rained. Not the soft, romantic kind of rain people write songs about. Cold Texas rain. The kind that soaks through shoes and makes parking lots shimmer beneath gray skies. I watched from inside the Houston Silver Fork Grill as my son stood awkwardly near the hostess station, wearing a black server uniform that looked painfully unfamiliar on him. For 20 years, Michael White had walked into restaurants wearing tailored suits and expensive watches while managers rushed to greet him. Today, nobody rushed. Today, he was just another waiter starting a shift. Arthur Bennett stood beside him holding a training clipboard. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Years earlier, Arthur used to teach teenage Michael how to carry trays properly during summer jobs. Now, he had to teach him all over again. Only this time, there were no special privileges. Michael looked tense already, embarrassed, defensive. Arthur handed him a notepad. "Table numbers first," he said calmly. Michael exhaled sharply. "I know how restaurants work." Arthur didn't react. "No," he replied quietly. "You know how boardrooms work." That landed harder than yelling ever could. I stayed near the back office, pretending to review inventory reports while secretly watching everything through the kitchen window. Part of me hated doing this to him. The other part knew it was necessary. Because Michael had forgotten something fundamental. You cannot lead people you no longer respect. The lunch rush started fast. Within 30 minutes, the restaurant filled with families escaping the rain. Children laughed loudly near the booths. Coffee machines hissed. Plates clattered. And for the first time in decades, Michael experienced the restaurant from the bottom instead of the top. It didn't go well. At first, he moved too slowly, then too quickly. He forgot drink refills, mixed up orders, nearly dropped a tray of iced tea near table 7. Several younger servers exchanged nervous glances watching him struggle. Not mockingly, uncomfortably, because everyone knew who he was, and everyone knew why he was there. Arthur remained firm but fair. No shortcuts, he repeated constantly. Michael's frustration built visibly by the hour. Around noon, a businessman in an expensive gray suit snapped his fingers impatiently from booth 14. "Excuse me," he barked. "We've been waiting 10 minutes for coffee." Michael immediately apologized and hurried away. But the man kept complaining loudly. This place used to have standards. I watched my son freeze briefly at those words. Because he used to say similar things himself. Now, he stood on the receiving end of them. By 1 o'clock, sweat soaked through the back of Michael's uniform shirt despite the restaurant air conditioning. His polished executive appearance had vanished completely. And strangely, he looked more like Edward than he had in years. Tired, real, human. Then came the moment that changed everything. An older, wealthy couple entered during the afternoon rush. The woman wore heavy jewelry and carried herself with the kind of superiority I'd seen countless times over the years. Michael approached their table politely. "Good afternoon, welcome to Silver Fork Grill." The woman interrupted immediately. "We asked for someone experienced." Michael blinked once. "I'm sorry?" She looked him up and down dismissively. "You seem confused already." Her husband laughed quietly. "I don't think he's used to places like this." The words hit me instantly, because I'd heard versions of them my entire life. Too poor, too simple, too common. Michael swallowed hard. "I assure you, I can help you." The woman sighed dramatically. "Fine, but please don't mess up our order." I saw something flicker across my son's face then. Not anger, recognition. For the first time in years, someone was making him feel small, insignificant, embarrassing. The exact way he made me feel that night in Chicago. Michael remained professional through the entire interaction, but I could see the humiliation settling heavily into him, especially when the woman later snapped her fingers again while saying loudly, "Server, are you paying attention or daydreaming, server?" Not Michael, not sir, just server. The same way he once reduced me to Hannah. I watched him quietly refill their waters while keeping his expression controlled. But something inside him was cracking. I could see it. Later that afternoon, Arthur sent Michael into the kitchen to help during a staffing shortage. Within minutes, chaos swallowed him. Orders piled up. A dishwasher called in sick. One cook burned his hand. And suddenly, Michael found himself carrying heavy tubs through steam and noise while cooks shouted ticket times around him. This used to be my world. Edward's too. The world Michael once respected before wealth convinced him he'd outgrown it. Around 4 o'clock, Michael accidentally burned his hand grabbing a hot skillet. He cursed under his breath immediately. One of the older line cooks, Mrs. Ramirez, glanced at him briefly. "Your mother burned herself worse than that almost every week back in the old days," she said casually. Michael froze. Mrs. Ramirez kept chopping vegetables. She never complained either. The kitchen went strangely quiet after that, because everyone there remembered me working pregnant, remembered Edward sleeping in office booths during overnight inventory counts, remembered sacrifice. Michael stared down at the small red burn on his hand like it suddenly meant something larger. Pain has a strange way of making people humble. By evening, exhaustion covered him completely. His shoulders slumped, his movements slowed, and the arrogance he carried for years seemed to fade with every difficult hour. Then came the final moment. Near closing time, an elderly man entered alone and sat at one of the corner booths. He looked tired and worn his jacket frayed at the sleeves. Michael approached carefully. The man ordered only soup and coffee. Nothing else. When the bill arrived, the old man quietly admitted he'd miscalculated his cash. "I'm sorry," he whispered embarrassedly. "I thought I had enough." The younger version of Michael would have immediately paid the difference himself. But this Michael hesitated. Not cruelly, uncertainly, like he no longer trusted his own instincts. Before he could respond, Mrs. Ramirez spoke from behind the counter. "Your mother used to cover meals like that all the time." The old man looked ashamed. "I can wash dishes or something." Michael stared at him silently for several long seconds, then slowly reached into his own pocket. "I've got it," he said quietly. The man looked stunned. "You don't have to." "Yes," Michael interrupted softly. "I do." Something shifted in the restaurant atmosphere then. Subtle, but real. Because kindness had finally appeared again in my son's voice. After closing, the staff began cleaning quietly while rain continued outside. Michael sat alone at a back booth staring at his burned hand. Exhaustion radiated from him. I approached slowly. He looked up immediately. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Michael laughed weakly. "I used to think this job was easy." I sat across from him quietly. "No honest work is easy." He looked around the empty restaurant. "I don't know how you and Dad did this for years. We believed in what we were building." Michael lowered his eyes. "I thought I believed too." The sadness in his voice hurt deeply. Because maybe he had once believed. Maybe success slowly poisoned him one compromise at a time. He rubbed his face tiredly. "That woman today." He swallowed hard. "The one who treated me like I was beneath her." I stayed silent. Michael looked up at me finally, and in a voice filled with shame, he whispered, "That's how you felt in Chicago, wasn't it?" Tears burned behind my eyes instantly. Because after all this time, my son finally understood. And suddenly, unexpectedly, Michael White began to cry. I had not seen my son cry since Edward's funeral. Even then, Michael tried hiding it. He stood beside me at the cemetery, wearing a black suit, 2 sizes too big jaw, clenched so tightly I thought he might break his own teeth, trying not to fall apart. But eventually, grief won. He collapsed against me afterward, like he was still a little boy. And now, years later, here he was again, sitting in a quiet restaurant booth after closing time with tears sliding silently down his face. Older, harder, broken in completely different ways. The restaurant around us had gone still. Chairs rested upside down on tables, while soft yellow lights glowed across the empty dining room. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. Michael wiped his face, quickly embarrassed. "I'm sorry," he muttered. "For what?" He laughed weakly. "Everything." The word hung between us heavily. I studied my son quietly. Without the expensive suits and executive confidence, he suddenly looked exhausted in a way I hadn't noticed before. Not physically, spiritually. Like he'd spent years running toward success without realizing how much of himself he was leaving behind. Michael stared down at his burned hand again. "I really thought I was helping the company," he whispered. "I know." His eyes lifted sharply. "You do?" "Yes." That seemed to surprise him. I folded my hands slowly on the table. "You wanted growth, stability, respect." I sighed softly. "Those things aren't wrong, Michael. Then why do I feel like a monster? Because somewhere along the way, ambition stopped being about building something better and started becoming about proving you were better than other people." But I didn't say that aloud. Instead, I asked quietly, "When was the last time you walked through one of our kitchens before this week?" Michael looked away immediately. That's what I thought. Silence settled again. Then Michael whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. "I hated seeing you there that night." My chest tightened. "At the restaurant?" He nodded slowly. "You looked—" He swallowed hard. "Small." The honesty hurt more than cruelty ever could. Because I finally understood something clearly. Michael wasn't ashamed of my past. He was terrified of vulnerability. Terrified that people might connect him to struggle, to weakness, to humanity. "I spent years trying to become someone important," he admitted quietly. "You already were important." He shook his head immediately. "No, Dad was important." His voice cracked slightly. "You were important." The grief beneath those words surprised me. Michael rubbed both hands over his face tiredly. "I always felt like I had to prove myself after he died." I stayed silent, because I understood. Edward had been larger than life to Michael. Kind, respected, loved by everyone. Trying to fill a dead father's shoes can destroy a son if he mistakes imitation for identity. Michael stared across the empty restaurant. When investors started taking me seriously, it felt good. There it was, the truth beneath everything. Validation, approval, status. He became addicted to admiration because grief left him insecure. "And Rebecca?" I asked carefully. Michael closed his eyes briefly. For the first time since all this began, genuine shame crossed his face. "She made me feel successful." The sadness in his voice nearly broke me. Not because he loved her, because he confused being admired with being loved. "They respected image," he continued quietly. "Money, exclusivity." He laughed bitterly. Eventually, I started believing that mattered more than everything else. I looked around the restaurant slowly. The booths, the coffee machines, the warm lighting. This place had fed thousands of people over the years, celebrated birthdays, comforted grieving families, created memories. And my son almost traded all of it away, chasing approval from strangers who would have forgotten his name within 5 years. Michael suddenly looked at me again. "When did you stop loving me?" The question hit so hard, I actually flinched. "Oh, Michael." Tears filled his eyes again immediately. "You looked at me in that boardroom like you didn't even know me anymore." Pain tightened in my chest. Because he was right. There were moments recently when I truly didn't recognize the man my son had become. But love had never disappeared. That was the tragedy of all this. "I never stopped loving you," I whispered. His face crumpled instantly. Then why does it feel like I lost everything? I leaned forward slowly. Because actions have consequences. The words came out softer than he deserved, but firm. Michael nodded weakly. I know. No, I said gently. I don't think you fully did, until now. He stared silently at the table. I humiliated you? Yes. I let Rebecca disrespect you? Yes. I erased you from the company. The pain behind those words nearly made me cry too. Yes. Michael swallowed hard. And you still love me? That question shattered something inside me completely. Because only deeply broken people ask if they're still lovable. I reached across the table slowly and covered his hand with mine. You are my son, I whispered. Nothing changes that. Michael bowed his head instantly as tears fell again. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Then quietly, almost like a child again, he admitted, I don't know how to fix this. I looked at him carefully. That depends. On what, whether you want to fix your reputation? I paused softly. Or your heart. Michael closed his eyes. And for the first time in years, I think he finally understood the difference. The restaurant door suddenly opened behind us. Both of us turned. Noah stepped inside, carrying a backpack over one shoulder. Relief crossed his face immediately when he saw us together. Arthur said you were still here? Michael quickly wiped his face again, embarrassed for his son to see him crying. But Noah didn't laugh, didn't judge. Instead, the boy walked straight toward his father slowly. For several tense seconds, nobody moved. Then Noah spoke quietly. I heard you covered a customer's meal today. Michael looked startled. It wasn't a big deal. Noah shook his head. Grandpa used to do that. Silence, heavy, emotional. Michael stared at his son like he didn't know how to respond. Then Noah did something unexpected. He sat down beside him. Not beside me. Beside his father. And suddenly I realized what was happening. Noah wasn't choosing sides anymore. He was hoping for reconciliation. Michael looked overwhelmed by the gesture. You're not mad at me, he asked quietly. Noah hesitated honestly. I was. Michael nodded slowly, like he deserved that. But Noah swallowed hard. I think maybe you're trying now. That nearly broke me all over again. Because forgiveness always sounds pure and noble in theory. But in reality, it usually begins with one exhausted person quietly deciding to hope again. Michael stared at his son silently before finally whispering, I'm sorry, Noah. The boy's eyes filled immediately, for what Michael's voice cracked, for teaching you the wrong things. Noah looked down quickly, fighting tears, and suddenly I saw it. Not a CEO, not a fallen executive, just a father trying desperately not to lose his child, the same way he nearly lost himself. Michael looked at me again after a long silence. What happens now? I took a slow breath. Then answered honestly. That depends on what kind of man you choose to become next. 6 months later, I walked back into the Chicago Silver Fork Grill, where my son once told waiters not to serve me. The moment the doors opened, memories rushed through me so strongly that I had to pause for a second. The soft piano music, the warm glow of chandeliers, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. But this time, everything felt different. Not because the restaurant had changed, because the people inside it had. A young hostess greeted me with a bright smile. Good evening, Mrs. White. I smiled back gently. Good evening, sweetheart. As I stepped further into the dining room, I noticed families laughing together over dinner. Elderly couples sat near the windows sipping coffee. Servers moved quickly between tables, But unlike before, the atmosphere no longer felt cold or exclusive. It felt alive again, warm again, human again. Exactly the way Edward always wanted. Then I saw him. Michael. He stood near the center aisle, wearing a simple black server uniform and apron, helping one of the younger waiters carry heavy trays during the dinner rush. No expensive watch, no designer suit, no executive arrogance, just honest work. For a brief moment, he looked so much like Edward that my chest tightened painfully. Michael noticed me almost immediately, and unlike that terrible night months earlier, he smiled. Not a polished business smile, a real one. He walked toward me calmly, wiping his hands on his apron. "Hi, Mom. Mom." The word still healed something inside me every time I heard it now. "Hi, sweetheart." For a second, we simply stood there looking at each other. Not perfect, not magically repaired, but trying. And sometimes trying is the bravest thing people can do after they've hurt each other deeply. Michael gently pulled out my chair himself at the table near the windows. The same table where I once sat invisible. This time, several employees smiled warmly as I passed. Arthur Bennett approached carrying menus. "Well," he laughed softly, "this feels a little better than last time." Michael actually looked embarrassed. "I deserve that." Arthur grinned. "You deserved worse." To my surprise, Michael laughed too. Real laughter. Not defensive, not bitter. And suddenly, I realized something important. Humility had softened him again. Pain had done what success never could. It gave him perspective. Noah arrived a few minutes later carrying a tray of drinks carefully balanced in his hands. "Grandma," he said proudly, "I made your sweet tea exactly the way you like it." I smiled immediately. "Then you're already more qualified than most executives?" The boy laughed while Michael shook his head. "You're creating another restaurant addict." "That's the plan," I replied. Noah had changed over the past months too. He spent weekends learning kitchen operations, inventory systems, and customer service. But more importantly, he learned something Michael forgot for many years. Restaurants weren't about status. They were about people. About creating places where strangers could feel welcomed. As dinner continued, I quietly watched my son work across the dining room. And what struck me most wasn't how hard he worked. It was how differently he treated people now. Every customer received patience. Every employee received respect. At one point, I watched Michael kneel beside an elderly customer struggling to hear the menu clearly. Instead of rushing her, he spoke slowly and kindly while helping her choose dinner. Months ago, that version of Michael barely existed anymore. Now it seemed to return piece by piece, not perfectly, but honestly. Later that evening, a young waitress accidentally dropped an entire tray of water glasses near the kitchen entrance. The crash silenced half the restaurant instantly. The poor girl looked horrified. "I'm so sorry," she whispered shakily. "I'm so sorry." Months earlier, Michael probably would have criticized her publicly. Tonight, he immediately grabbed towels and knelt beside her, helping clean the mess. "Hey," he said gently, "nobody died. Take a breath." The girl looked close to tears. "I ruined everything." Michael smiled softly. "My father once dropped chili on a customer during opening week." He nodded toward me. "And my mother dropped coffee on a truck driver, her first day as a waitress." The girl looked stunned. "You did?" I laughed from the table. "Oh, sweetheart, it was terrible." The entire staff laughed warmly, and suddenly, in that simple moment, I felt Edward's presence so strongly it almost hurt. Because this was what he built. Not luxury, not prestige, grace, mercy, Humanity. After closing time, the restaurant slowly emptied until only staff remained cleaning tables and counting receipts. Michael finally sat across from me looking completely exhausted. "You still work too hard," I said softly. He smiled faintly. "Now I know where I got it from." There was silence for a moment before his expression grew more serious. "I've been meaning to ask you something." I waited quietly. Michael looked down at his hands. "Do you think Dad would be disappointed in me?" The vulnerability in his voice nearly broke my heart again. I answered honestly. "I think your father would have been heartbroken by some of your choices." Michael nodded slowly, like he expected that, but I continued gently. "I also think he would have been proud that you found your way back before it was too late." Tears gathered in Michael's eyes instantly. He looked away quickly. "I almost destroyed everything." "Yes," I admitted softly. His jaw tightened painfully. "I hate who I became." I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. "Then don't become him again. That simple, that hard." Michael squeezed my hand tightly, and for the first time in many years, I felt my son holding on to me instead of pulling away. Noah suddenly approached carrying an old framed photograph. "Look what Arthur found in storage." My breath caught instantly. It was the original opening day picture from our first restaurant. Edward smiling proudly, me holding a coffee pot, little Michael standing between us in his tiny apron. For several seconds, none of us spoke. Then Noah smiled softly. "We should hang it in every location." Michael looked at the photo for a long time before whispering, "Yeah." Not because it looked polished, not because it impressed investors, because it told the truth. And finally, the truth no longer embarrassed him. Several weeks later, the board officially announced Silver Fork Grill would remain family-operated. Community programs returned. Employee benefits improved, and Michael voluntarily chose to continue working restaurant operations before taking any future leadership role again. Not as punishment, as rebuilding. And Noah well. Noah became the first person in years who made me excited about the company's future again. Not because he was ambitious, because he was kind. That mattered more. As I looked around the restaurant one final time that night, Michael suddenly stood and gently pulled my chair back for me. The same son who once let waiters ignore me now walked beside me to the front doors himself. Outside, snow drifted softly across Chicago once again. But unlike before, I no longer felt cold. Because sometimes families break slowly, and sometimes healing happens even slower. But if love survives long enough, people can still find their way home. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like and subscribe. And I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever forgiven someone who deeply hurt you? Or has someone ever forgiven you when you didn't deserve it? Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every comment, and your stories mean more to me than you know.